How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 57th video on channel, and today we're going to be continuing our series on the process philosophers. Last time, we went over the second lecture from Alfred North Whitehead's Modes of Thought, titled Expression. Now, for today, we're going to return to the work of Henri Bergson, with The Possible and the Real, an essay he wrote as an apology for being unable to give a lecture in Stockholm following being awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Without further ado, let's get into it. Bergson begins by outlining one of the paper's central themes, the creative nature of a universe, which he sees as constantly producing novelty. This is something that we find all around us, no matter how hard we try to organize things before they happen. To demonstrate this fact, he offers the example of a social gathering. Here you might know who will come, what they will talk about, and so on. But no matter what, the reality of a situation will be completely different to its abstraction. As he himself puts it,
"Gone is the image I had conceived of it, a mere prearrangeable juxtaposition of things already known."
Someone might object that the reason for this lies in the inability to control the gestures, actions, and words of others, hence novelty. However, as Bergson says, we find the same effect in acts that we are the sole agents of. We might think about an action before we take it, and draw sketches of what it might look like when it's carried out, but its actualization will always be completely unique, in its own way. Even this, he concedes, can be objected to under the notion that the soul is separate from matter, and that the so-called material world is nothing but the repetition of certain laws. The way Bergson gets around this problem is by classifying such a conception of reality as an abstraction. The real world is filled with living beings, not just the inert. Everywhere we find novelty being actualized in these things. Just take evolution, which applies just as much to what we consider to not be conscious, like plants, as to humans and other animals. Going even further, he questions the way we talk about the inert as a frame for life. In a way quite reminiscent of Deleuze, he describes his understanding of matter. It isn't just a mechanical thing. Rather, the repetition it undergoes is creative in its own right, giving rise to change. There's a close relationship between the inorganic and the organic when it comes to duration, a concept we covered in our second episode in this series. As he says of inorganic things,
"I should compare them to the swinging of the pendulum on the clock. The swingings of the pendulum are coupled to the continuous unwinding of a spring, linking them together, and whose unwinding they mark."
In this unwinding, the repetitions that define the inorganic world act to give rhythm to living beings. The result is duration itself, which he defines here as a continuous elaboration of what is new, an endless creative becoming that just keeps going. You can only get to that abstract universe where everything is given in advance by essentially removing this element, ignoring the many living and conscious things that actually inhabit our world. Here he stresses the role of time. It is this that stops the world from being static. Instead, it acts as a kind of creative indeterminacy that prevents everything from being given all at once. Bergson is fully cognizant of the fact that many philosophers would disagree with him on this point. As he says, it goes against the faculty of intelligence itself, again something we looked at in our video on an introduction to metaphysics. There's a kind of intuition that lies behind our creative abilities, but this necessarily falls away when we focus on what he calls our intellectuality. Take the case of a sculptor, for instance. Insofar as they are creative, there's no real need for intelligence or anything of that sort. They just make, producing novelty. However, they must also know all about technique, something that is in fact based in intelligence. On this layer, there is no creativity. There's only repetition and manufacture, to borrow Bergson's phrasing. The same thing applies to our character and personality. It's easy enough to just go with the flow, evolving and shifting as time goes on. Everything becomes difficult when we instead turn our intelligence to that movement. To borrow his words,
"To learn more would require us to turn back to ourselves, to philosophize, to swim against the current of nature, for nature wants action and has hardly ever thought of speculation."
Nevertheless, this isn't to say that this form of thinking is bad in any way. As Bergson is careful to stress, technique is important to the sculptor, just like self-analysis is important to, well, everyone. In fact, he goes as far as to say that we find newness only through the repetitive sameness that we discover through analysis. Problems only arise when intelligence seeks to account for the absoluteness of creativity and the sympathy of intuition in the same way that it might deal with what is matter of fact. Following from this, Bergson claims that many of the big metaphysical problems are ill-posed, partially due to this confusion. These fundamentally come from the way we think about creation as a kind of assembly process, where it's a question of arranging bits and pieces like a puzzle. From this point of view, where there's only a set number of components involved, everything is given in advance. There's only a finite number of combinations after all. Moreover, there's a tendency to think about reality through the lens of space being a container, which gives the impression that it simply fills up an absence of sorts. For Bergson, as you'll soon see, nothing could be farther from the truth. To begin with, he describes reality as like a constantly floating balloon that takes on unexpected forms every instant. In his eyes, it works through a gradual growth that experiences ever more creativity. Going further, the role of space is additionally secondary to that of time. At this point, he remarks that there are two major types of false problem in metaphysics, the first corresponding to theories of being, the second to theories of knowledge. On the former, Bergson writes,
"The first consists in asking oneself why there is being, why something or someone exists. The nature of what exists doesn't matter. Just say that there is matter, or mind, or both."
The problem with this lies in the fact that it's based on the assumption that something, or rather nothing, precedes being. Nothing for Bergson is useless. It simply designates the lack of what we expect, want, or look to find. Here, he argues that there is no true void in reality. Instead, we can only perceive fullness and being. Hence his claim that the word nothing is exactly the same as the word all, just with an operation of thought. As seen in this diagram, the same thing applies for disorder. In both cases, Bergson sees the problem as stemming from a confusion between the more and the less. When we say that there is nothing, we act as if there's an addition that makes it something that holds true for the other term as well. However, in actuality, these ideas of absence contain more intellectual content than their counterparts, for the simple reason that it's impossible to find disorder or nothingness in such a state. Instead, there has to be an action that projects them backwards, what Bergson will come to call the retrograde movement of the true. At this point, he turns his attention towards the concepts that adorn the title of this essay, the real and the possible. In his eyes, their confusion is a major problem when it comes to trying to understand the creative nature of reality. Problems come up primarily for the same reason as for disorder and nothingness, where we imagine that the possible is less than the real, and that it precedes actual things. The issue Bergson has with this is that it is mechanical. It professes that everything can be given in advance, since by necessity all things must be possible and thus representable before they're real. However, as we saw with disorder and nothingness, this is a fallacy. In his words,
"The possible is simply the real with, in addition, a mental act that casts its image into the past once it has been produced. It's just that our intellectual habits prevent us from seeing this."
To illustrate this, Bergson gives an account of a conversation he once had concerning the future of literature after World War I. When he was asked how he pictured it to be, he responded that he, doesn't picture it. Pressing further, his partner wondered what Bergson thought about the form the great dramatic works of the future would take. Bergson's answer, apparently quite astonishing to his interviewer, was that, if he knew their form, he would write them himself. Here, it gets a bit strange. Continuing on, Bergson tells his partner that he isn't talking about possibilities. Instead, he says that when a great work of literature or art comes to be, it's real. It only becomes possible retroactively. That's to say, it wouldn't have been possible if the writer or artist didn't spring up and make it. The response he gets is that he's going too far. It seems like he's insisting that the future influences the present, and the present influences the past, making it so actions run backwards. Bergson's argument against this accusation is that what he's really saying is that the possible can be lodged in the past, not that you can change it via some sort of strange metaphysical time machine. It's this idea of lodging that his partner forgot when he asked Bergson about the theatre of tomorrow. In a vague sense, though, he was right. To say that Hamlet was possible before Shakespeare wrote it isn't quite false, in the sense that it wasn't impossible. That's to say, there weren't really any obstacles stopping it from being written down. Nevertheless, this way of thinking is, quite frankly, pointless. It has nothing to do with pre-existence. As an example, he says that you can lock a gate and thus be sure no one will cross it, but once it's unlocked, you have no clue who might possibly pass through. Moreover, as he himself puts it,
yet from the completely negative sense of possible, you pass surreptitiously, unconsciously, to the positive.
Possibility in the one sense is just about the absence of an obstacle. However, in another sense, it becomes all about what Bergson terms a pre-existence in the form of an idea. The first is a tautology. All you're saying is that once things have been surmounted, they're surmountable. Not exactly profound stuff. The second, on the other hand, is an absurdity for Bergson. This is because, quite simply, if something like Hamlet was already possible in everybody's minds, it would have been written down immediately. If it was possible in both senses, how could it have taken until Shakespeare's time to produce it? Moving on, Bergson says that the very same things apply to nature as to art and literature. The reason why we don't acknowledge this fact is that we always fall under the illusion of a more and the less. At this point, he calls for the possible to be returned to its proper place, and for creativity to be able to do its work. In particular, he opposes the idea that things like evolution function as if executing a program, instead of simply being an endless process of creative heterogenesis, to borrow from Guattari. As Bergson writes,
to accept the postulate of the opposing theory is to let the enemy right into the camp. We must take a side. It is reality that makes itself possible, and not possibility that becomes real.
Now, with this, we're done with Henri Bergson's essay The Possible and the Real, having gained an understanding of how the two concepts relate. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments, so I can do better. Next time we'll be covering a chapter of Bergsonism by Deleuze. Until then, bye!